always do these examination, and yet then most of us tend to recapitulate that we might have missed that or this. So testicular examination in males is doubtly one of the important investigation that we should be doing for all our patients. Many times we have come across that in the second and the third visit we remembered we didn't examine the testes, and there were uh, the germ cell tumors, there were the testicular lymphomas, and there were a lot of other hidden diagnosis in between those bands. And especially for the females also, the breast examination, the pelvic examination, the PV examination at the first visit is very important. It establishes not only the doctor patient rapport but also a very important finding in this paradigm of metastasis of unknown primary. Head neck examination doesn't only include the oral examination and the nasal examination. It also includes, I believe, the Hopkins, which we should be doing for most of our patients on a regular basis, because there are those unhidden pearls that we would have missed if we wouldn't have put that scope inside, which is very simple and very easy to do, and then yet again we find that we are not doing it on a routinely basis for all our patients on a regular manner. Then comes the investigations, what we should be doing as a baseline. The complete blood count is again an important investigation. We should be not only specifically saying the complete blood count, but the peripheral smear examination also is a very important step that we should be doing for all our patients. The liver and the kidney function test again then forms a very important basis for our um, finding out whether not only for the prognostication, not only for therapy consideration, but also for uh, whether it's a tumor lysis associated or not. The LDH gives us a pseudo marker of how much is the activity of these cells. A leukemia cells, a lymphoma cells with a high LDH shows that these are very high proliferative tumor, invariably reflecting the chemosensitivity of that. And the serum electrolytes, the calcium, the magnesium, the phosphorus, all of these uh, not only directing us to the tumor lysis syndrome profile, but also invariably the clinical management. Because at the end of the day, the therapy which we have to give is a holistic care. We don't just have to give the chemotherapies, we don't have to just give the radiation, or we don't just have to operate. It's the complete here, the complete performer that we have to manage. We have to manage the elevated calciums, we have to manage the elevated phosphoruses, we have to manage the low sodiums. That again are separate topics which we will be discussing in future, but right now they form an important baseline investigation, because that gives us a holistic important supportive care management that we are going to deal with it. Many times we find that these tumor markers, in males PSA, in females CA125, CEA, CA199, they tend to tell us a direction among the ocean where we are heading to, and it gives us a small um, clue. Many times when we see that in bilateral ovarian masses with CA125 not that much elevated and CACA199 quite elevated, the GI focus is always and always there, because there might be an underlying Kuchenberg that has there, and burnout primary that has been there, and that's why this is a very important investigation, I feel. Because then instead of directing our whole and soul to the ovarian primary, we might direct it to the GI primary, and there it lies a lot of time. These tumor markers important. Yet another tumor marker that needs to be established, and that has uh, made a whole change, that we don't even go for biopsies, is the AFP and the beta HCG. AFP for the germ cell tumors as well as the hepatocellular carcinomas. The sensitivity of these markers have been so much there that we can even avoid the biopsies and start the treatment ASAP for many of the germ cell tumors with choriocarcinoma like picture, or a hepatocellular with a radiological picture with an AFP elevated. So that these slide does show a very important first step, the first visit to the patient to us, in in deciding the whole treatment for the next few months that we are going to take for them. Then comes the investigations that we need to find out. We tend to say the CECT thorax, abdomen, and the mammography for females, especially over the 45 years of age group, because we tend to find out radiologically where it is there. The PET scan, no doubt, helps in 33% of our cases, especially for those with a squamous cell carcinomas. We tend to identify whether the patients are for a definitive local treatment, or we can they are a metastatic situation which we are dealing with it. There is a concept, a triple scopy. When you find the neck node mass and you don't know where the exact primary is, you tend to do the three investigations of going through the nasopharynx, going through the bronchoscope, and going through the upper GI endoscopy. And they tend to upstage or tend to localize the disease at least in 20% of our patients. As I told in the previous, with the elevated tumor markers, you tend to find out the upper GI and the lower GI foci. And many times we have found an occult primary hanging in there with just not even being visible on a radiological investigations. No doubt the physician hands are very sensitive, but again, we tend to confirm our findings with definitely a testicular ultrasound. If there is a finding that you are not sure of, that you have a suspect of, do confirm it, because there are many times small microlithiasis, a foci of cancers inside those testes, and that needs to be very much elucidated. Transvaginal ultrasound again is a part and parcel of our PV examination, and that helps to corroborate the clinical findings that we have. And the breast MRI in those where young females, especially where the mammography is not that much helpful, and we tend to think that there are masses, and that's why that investigation has become a part and parcel of our breast findings. Now, when we go for the biopsy of that mass, most of time it comes out to be carcinoma. And when we have to divide them, the carcinoma can be divided into an adenocarcinoma, a poorly differentiated carcinoma, a squamous cell carcinoma, or a neuroendocrine tumors, because these are the most common histologies in terms of the incidence of the findings of them. There are other sometimes the IHC, and that's why, because only identification of a malignant cell is not sufficient, because your whole treatment is going to change based on what the IHC tells us. Is it a melanoma? Is it a lymphoma? Is it a sarcoma? And we have the various IHC markers that we will discuss in next subsequent slide, as what gives us a characteristic as where our direction of treatment and direction of management is going to head on to. So it is a very simple thing that all the pathologists do when they find out that there is a carcinoma, there are malignant cells inside that biopsy, and they do a CK marker for them. So CK is a cytokeratin, it's a pan marker, and it tells us, yes, it is a carcinoma. The next thing is they put out is a CK7 and a CK20. So when both of them are positive, that means that the tumor is either in an upper GI tract, or it's a pancreatic, or it's a urothelial tract. When CK20 is positive, it's highly specific for colon and Merkel cell. When CK7 is positive, it is not that much sensitive. You tend to find out it's breast, ovary, lung, endometrium, thyroid, and then you put out other markers, especially the TTF, to find out the other sources. When both of them are negative, then prostate and hepatocellular and adrenocortical are there. So these two markers alone is the first test as a reflex. If the CK is positive, it's a carcinoma. You see a CK20, and then you know that it's a colon. When you see a CK7 and 20 positive, it's an upper GI, stomach, pancreatic. And when you see both of them to be negative, it's a prostate or a HCC, and then you tend to collaborate with the clinical findings. The next marker they've put when the other are negative is the CD45, which tends to direct us towards whether it's a lymphoma or a hematological malignancies. The S100 gives us a direction towards the melanoma. Neuroendocrine tumors are sensitive and they are only positive for the synaptophysin and chromogranin uh, markers. And if they are uh, positive, your anxiety and your apprehension and your palpitations are definitely relieved, because you know the diagnosis that it's a small cell cancer, it's a neuroendocrine tumor. And that's why the IHC is very, very important, because three-fourths of our patients, 60 to 64 7% of our patients tend to get these diagnoses only by the IHC. A very simple test, and then you have to find out what the primary is. These are very specific primaries, and they have a very specific markers to it. So with an ovarian masses, you see a PAX8 positive, that clearly gives you a PAX ovary cancer diagnosis. With RCC and thyroid, you have a differential of being a PAX8 positive. Many times you find out that there's an ovarian mass and then the PAX8 is negative. I would definitely suggest them to go back to go an upper GI and lower GI, because then again you tend to find out those masses there. TTF1 again is adenocarcinoma lung, and you tend to find out that there. The second is the thyroid, where it is quite common. The napsin is again ovarian with a clear cell variant, a lung, and a papillary RCC variant. Breast, if you have to be there, it is there. The GATA3 tends to help you with that, and the ERPR also tends to help with the diagnosis. Then again is the colon, where you see most likely the CDX2 is positive. The P63 and CK5 and 6 are positive in squamous cell carcinomas. In thyroid cancers, the thyroglobulin, and in papillary cancer ovary, again the thyroglobulin is positive. For hepatocellular carcinomas, the arginase and HEPAR are the specific test, and for prostate, PSA and NKX3 are the specific test. For the adrenocortical carcinomas, these are the inhibin is the specific IHC marker that has to rule out. With the clinical, radiological, and the histopathological profile, these markers are just confirmatory, that when you put them you tend to get the diagnosis. So first step is definitely the history, second is definitely the investigation, um, the examination, the third is the investigation, and then with the confirmation of the malignancies, you tend to find out these primary sites through them. Now, another concept was the gene expression profile of these patients. There are various platforms for it, and it has been available for over a decade and has stayed there. The cancer type, the biotheranostic one, is the 92 gene panel, where they put 92 gene RT-PCR assays and tend to find out the localization of what is to be the primary of it. The cancer origin, the Rosetta Genomics panel, has a 64 microRNA gene expression level test. What these tend to say on a molecular profile, where is the primary carcinoma of the origin, and they most of the time also have a very good sensitivity of 85 to 89% of them. And when you compare whether the IHC and the molecular, both the trials where the pathologists were blinded to the tumor types and performed the IHCs and compared them with the molecular test, both the studies said that the molecular tests were much more accurate. The differences were accentuated when the tumors that were poorly differentiated, that is 83% versus 67% in a poorly differentiated carcinomas. These are the papers where it says that even though you look at those patients with a histological diagnosis of predominantly what the normal profile is, the adeno, the poorly differentiated, the squamous, neuroendocrine, and then you tend to find out what are the various primary origin of these tumors through the molecular profiles they have put it onto. Now comes what could be the role ahead, where we go it. If the anatomic site is determined, we have to treat it as per the primary site, as most of the cases in them the anatomy is determined. We took out the histopathological diagnosis, we put the IHC markers, confirm it, and then do the site specific treatment, which includes whatever the drugs is. We need to put out an additional IHCs also to find out what the sensitivity of these drugs is. So suppose it comes out to be a lung cancer, adenocarcinoma, you put out the EGFR, ALK, ROS, NTRK, BRAF, HER2/neu, and so forth and so on markers. It comes out to be breast, you put out ER, PR, HER2/neu, PDL1, and so forth and so less. Just because not only the diagnosis is important, because you also need to find out what could be the best suitable targeted therapy for these patients. When the anatomic primary site is not detected, as in 2 to 3% of all these patients, you take out those which are overtly visible to you of an appropriate lesion, put out those IHC, put out the molecular profile, and you tend to get your diagnosis. And if again doesn't go as per the uh, majority, in 5 to 10%, where you don't tend to find out whatever
9 बजे से कर लेंगे ठीक है
whatever the best it is, you put them either on an empirical chemotherapy or on a clinical trial. Whatever be the best traditional first line chemotherapy, the response rate hasn't been that much good, with less than 40%. If you put them on an empirical chemotherapy with a paclitaxel platinum combination or a gemcitabine platinum combination or a vinorelbine combination, with a 2-year OS of around 20%, with a median overall survival of 11 months. But that's only the half side of the story. With new molecular profile, with new molecular targeted therapies, that there has been a basket of uh, uh, clinical trials. There has been a basket of a lot of treatment options, and irrespective of we get or we don't get the diagnosis, but yes, the targeted approach is always there, and you tend to find out the best possible treatment for these patients. And that's why the site specific approach a prospective trial was done at a Sarah Cannon Research Institute, where they did a molecular gene expression profile to predict the tissue of the origin and also to direct the site specific therapy in patients with carcinoma of unknown primary site. And with 289 patients, with 252 of them were being successful from or localizing what was the primary site, and 247 had the tissue of origin among themselves. So the sites were biliary tract in 18%, urothelial in 11%, colorectal in 10%, and in 7% it was non-small cell carcinomas. Out of these 252 successful patients, 194 patients were underwent the treatment based on the site of the origin, with a median OS being around 12 and a half months. For more responsive sites, 13. So that was the difference of giving a site specific approach. Survival was 13.4 months as compared to the 7.6 months, respectively, with a significant p value. When a subsite is identified with a molecular assay, specific markers are given, you tend to localize a much better tumors, and then you tend to give a targeted therapy to them. Then it does make a difference and the ultimate outcome. So you tend to find out HER2/neu in breast, colon, stomach, the EGFR, ALK, ROS, NTRK, BRAF, PDL1, MSI in lung. Again, the KRAS, NRAS, BRAF, MSI for colon. For most of these tumors, you also tend to do an additional PDL1 test. In head neck, also, you tend to do a PDL1 test by a combined proportionate score. And then you tend to find out their sensitivity for the immunotherapy, which can be elucidated for this. Another molecule that has gained quite a lot of attraction over the past few years, especially in carcinomas of unknown primary, you tend to do uh, a TRK fusion, and then you find out among them if they were positive. For those who were positive with the TRK fusion protein, you gave out the TRK inhibitor, that is larotrectinib, also known as commonly by the LOXO 101, which is a selective tropomyosin receptor kinase inhibitor. And you could see that out of 178% responded. Response, and these are some of those patients who have been relapsed refractory, and they many in multiple lines and previously treated. And then you find out only with a pill you can get a 78% response rate. That again is an amazing development. The median duration of response wasn't reached, as majority of the responders which were responding were keep on responding, and they were on without progression. In fact, the longest responder remained on treatment at 23 months. 8% patients had a response of more than a year, and 16 patients are more than of a 6 months. So all of these tends to give us in a direction that yes, the molecular therapy is the new sun here, and it's all going to change over the next few years with a more and more molecular for it says there. And then comes the role of the PDI, which I told was that when you they tend to give us a direction whether the immunotherapy which you are going to offer them are going to be a benefit or not. So if the MSI is low, um, the MMR is deficient, then these patients tend to, sorry, if the MSI is high and the MMR is deficient, they tend to have a sensitivity to immunotherapy, and the response rates are proportional to the MSI instability. That is, the higher the MSI instability, the deficiency of MMR pathway gives them a predominance, predilection for an immunotherapy response. And you could see for those who had these, there was 40% who responded as against those with an MSI stable or a low or an MMR proficient pathway, where none of them responded to the immunotherapy. Similarly was the 5-month PFS, where the MSI high or the MMR deficient were responding in 78% of patients at 5-month interval, while those with an MSI low or stable and a MMR non-deficient or a proficient, only 11% responded. So that's the end of my slide. I thank again Dr. Shubham and the whole team for giving me an opportunity, and would love to take any questions if there are any.
Thanks, Vikas. It's a really crisp presentation, but it raises some of my doubts, which I'm happy that I'll ask you, because this is what we come across in clinical practice is that, when we talk of metastasis of unknown primary, it would usually start with, it could be a lymph node in the neck, it could be a met in the lung, it could be a lesion in the liver. Okay, these are the three most common things which comes to your mind when you start thinking of, I don't know where it came from. So once a patient comes to you with any of these three things, obviously after the clinical examination, uh, suppose if it's a liver primary and it looks like a met and there is no other physical finding or a finding on clinical history that you could elucidate, would you go for a biopsy first or would you go for a PET CT? My question is that, both of us are now in a clinical practice and we are cost conscious. It's very important to get cost into this, and also time, because time is pertinent for the patient, and most of our patients now are very impatient. So they want answers quickly and they want answers to given on spot, and they put us in a spot where we tend to skip steps in workup of a patient. So it's not a bookish to talk only of steps, but to my question is, how soon would you jump to a PET CT and not get into all these tumor markers and stuff like that?
So for me, it is very important that when you look at a liver, you see it is a primary or it looks like a secondary. For whatever base, get a non-invasive test as better it is, because no doubt biopsy is definitely an important part for elucidating it, but it always comes in a third step as compared to the non-invasive. So I would definitely go for a radiological investigation. My preference would be first to do an AFP, first to do all those tumor markers upfront, and then go for the third step would be the radiology. And then if nothing comes out in PET, then probably going for a uh, biopsy, because invariably you have a lot of markers in IHC where you tend to put it onto. Uh, so all of these would be very efficient at the end of the day to confirm. So biopsy is the confirmation test. uh, all of these are other the staging investigations. So that's why we need to first of all do what is necessary to find out, is it only the liver that is being affected, whether there is a lung mass, whether there are breast masses, whether there are other masses that are there. And then at the end of the day you have a selective stains, because uh, whatever the best biopsy you do, I would be more conserved on not using it on a the IHCs for diagnostic purposes. I would be much more using my tissue for a molecular purposes. So, just to give an idea, many times what we
So,
see patient getting an ultrasound, and you find a liver metastatic. I would definitely ask them to get a CECT thorax along with the tumor markers. And if there is a lung mass and there is a liver uh, metastatic to suggestive of metastatic to it, I would ask the pathologist not to waste on the other CK7 lymphoma and the markers. Use that tissue for a molecular testing so that I can direct my therapy towards it.
so if I get you correctly, Dr. Vikas, you will confirm whether it is metastatic or not, by imaging, imaging characteristics, probably an ultrasound, because that is how the mass would have most likely been detected on a ultrasound or a CT scan. So you will confirm whether it's looking like a metastatic or a primary to begin with. You will get the tumor markers, which is again a non-invasive test. Then probably if you are not able to spot a specific primary, you will go for a PET CT scan first, which will give you this likely area to look into, and then you will go for a tissue diagnosis. And you want to stress on the fact that you would want to preserve that tissue for molecular analysis and not waste it on having a battery of IHC. You know how we go about it. You get 4 IHCs done first. When it confirms it's a carcinoma, then you have another 4 set of IHCs done according to age and sex of the patient. And when that 4 fails, then you have another 4 set, which I agree depletes the tissue. So that is what has to creep up in our workup, that we have to give importance not to the IHC but also to the molecular testing. And when tissue is scarce, we have to ensure that we optimally utilize it. So that is one thing. Dr. Geeta has pertinently asked a very important question, that what would be the role of liquid biopsy in uh, a case of MUO? Suppose you are unable to reach a diagnosis with the IHC, they just, with the biopsy, they just tell you, and most of the times it happens, they just tell you it's a poorly differentiated tissue, tumor. Then how would you go about it, and when would you consider getting a liquid biopsy?
So 5 years back, again, I would have said that no, I don't think so that's much a role. But over the years, when I've practiced and I've seen, uh, liquid biopsy has evolved a lot. So we started with probably only for a liquid biopsy, we did a concordance for the EGFR thing, that if there's a present of the EGFR mutation in biopsy, it's also present in the blood. But over the years, what we have seen, the Roche, the other platforms, the core, they have developed the Cardant and the foundation. And what they have collaborated is, and they have recently got an FDA approval for it also, that no matter how much tissue we take it out, it's going to be at the end of the day sometimes insufficient. So we have to find out a alternative method, and liquid biopsy does it. So if there is an in liquid biopsy a mutation is detected, it is definitely we give a targeted therapy to that, and it does have an implication in the survival of the patient. Many times in biopsies we don't find those EGFR, ALK, ROS, PDL1, NTRK mutations, but in liquid biopsies we tend to find out. And there comes the role of liquid biopsy. So I believe that liquid biopsy is a very important tool for those patients who have an affordability and where the biopsy and the tissue is a issue, and it does definitely has an important implication for all our patients, especially in the lung and the GI. The liquid biopsy has definitely changed the management over the last few years.
Okay, so liquid biopsy is not the first thing to do, but you will actually do it when tissue is an issue, and you will reserve it if there is no issue. Okay, so there's a couple of questions which are very specific questions by Dr. Parmod, and I'll take them in a little while. Dr. Nidhi is asking, just like we discussed about the liver cup, how about if it's an adenocarcinoma of a neck node? Okay, if you find a neck node and you find it's looking on a FNAC or in a say a biopsy, they tell you it's a adenocarcinoma. How would you approach it? I mean, other than clinical examination and the clinical history.
So, an adenocarcinoma of a neck will definitely be a mind-boggling thing for everybody of us, because if it would have been a squamous, I would have definitely think of an head neck primary. Um, we tend to then find out by radiological investigations that is the salivary gland being a tumor. We tend to localize through the triple endoscopies whether